In the kingdom of Arendar, there was a tale that had been whispered for years, one of an alpha king and his silent queen. The kingdom was ruled by King Aldrin, a man of great power, wisdom, and fearsome strength. He was the ruler of the most formidable army in the land, feared and respected by all who knew him. Yet there was one thing that he lacked: a true connection with his wife, Queen Lyra. Lyra had been promised to Aldrin in a union forged by duty and political alliance. She was a woman of grace and beauty, but her marriage to Aldrin was more a symbol of power than love. For 7 years, they had shared a kingdom, a throne, and a crown. But the bond between them had been nothing more than a mere formality. In public, they were seen together, rulers united. But in the privacy of their chambers, they were strangers. Aldrin never touched her, never spoke of his feelings, never sought her company in a way that spoke of affection. Queen Lyra had accepted her role in silence. She knew her position was one of service to the kingdom. She spent her days attending to the people, advising the court, and ensuring the peace of the realm. Her heart, however, remained distant, locked away behind the walls of her own desires. She was a queen in title, but not in heart. It wasn't that Aldrin didn't notice her. He had observed the quiet grace with which she carried herself, the strength in her eyes when she spoke of the people, the way she held her own in court. But there was something about her that unnerved him. Perhaps it was the way she never asked for anything from him. Perhaps it was the way she wore her loneliness like a crown, bearing it with dignity and silence. And so he kept his distance, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. But tonight, as the full moon cast its silver light over the kingdom, something changed. King Aldrin stood alone on the balcony of the royal palace, gazing out over the vast landscape of Arendar. The stars twinkled above as if they were watching him, waiting for him to make a decision that he had long avoided. His heart was heavy with an unfamiliar weight. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, a warrior who led with strength and resolve. But in his marriage, he had faltered. He had kept his distance from the one person who deserved his attention the most. Lyra had entered the room quietly, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floors. She stood a few feet away from him, watching him as he stared into the night. There was no need for words. She had learned over the years that silence spoke louder than any declaration of love could. But tonight, there was a shift in the air, something different, something that neither of them could ignore. "Aldrin," she said softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with an intensity she had not seen in years. "Lyra." He responded, his voice low but steady. The space between them seemed vast, yet the air between them hummed with a quiet electricity. "You have been a faithful queen, a silent one, but faithful nonetheless." She nodded, but there was a slight tremor in her hands, something that betrayed her calm exterior. "I have served as I was meant to. I have served you and this kingdom." Aldrin stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming yet gentle. "You deserve more than service, Lyra. You deserve respect. You deserve a connection that goes beyond duty." She met his gaze, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. "And what of you, my king? Do you deserve the same?" Aldrin paused, his breath catching in his throat. He had never truly understood what she had been asking of him all these years. The question had always lingered, like a shadow in the corners of his mind, but he had been too afraid to confront it. Now, as he stood before her, the weight of her words hit him harder than any battle he had ever fought. "I have failed you," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I have kept my distance, thinking that power was all that mattered. But now I see that what matters most is the bond we share, the bond we should have had from the start." Lyra's eyes softened, though there was a sadness there, a quiet ache. "It is not too late, Aldrin," she said gently, her words a balm to his wounded soul. "The bond you speak of can still be forged, but it will take more than just words." Aldrin stepped even closer, now standing directly before her. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a strand of her hair behind her ear. The touch was light, but it sent a surge of warmth through both of them. "I want to try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's heart fluttered in her chest, but she did not pull away. She had never expected him to come to this realization, not after all these years. Yet here he was, standing before her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him before. "I do not need grand gestures, Aldrin," she said softly. "I need you to see me, to understand me, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a woman." Aldrin's heart ached at her words. For so long, he had seen her as a queen first, as his duty, as his responsibility. But now, in the quiet moments of the night, he saw her for who she truly was, a woman of depth, of strength, of beauty that went beyond the surface. She was not just a queen. She was his equal, his partner. "I see you, Lyra," he said earnestly, "and I want to be the man you deserve." For the first time in 7 years, their eyes met without the walls that had stood between them. The space between them was no longer filled with silence, but with an unspoken understanding, a mutual desire for something more. As the night deepened, they stood together, side by side, no longer bound by the weight of duty, but by something far stronger, a bond that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The moonlight bathed them in its soft glow, casting their shadows long on the stone floor, but for the first time, those shadows seemed to merge. The Alpha King and his queen had finally begun to find their way to each other, not through power or politics, but through the quiet, steady pull of something far deeper. The days following the quiet exchange between King Aldrin and Queen Lyra were unlike any they had experienced before. In the past, their interactions had been distant, filled with the formalities required by their positions. But now, something had shifted. Both knew that the path ahead was uncertain, yet it was a path they were both willing to walk together. Aldrin found himself restless. The weight of the crown had never felt so heavy before. He had spent so many years leading his kingdom with strength and determination, but now he realized that the kingdom he ruled was not just the land and its people. It was also the heart of the woman beside him. He had neglected her for far too long. Thinking that his power was enough to hold everything together, Lyra, too, had noticed the change. The air around her felt different. For the first time, she felt truly seen by her husband. It wasn't just his words that had shifted, but his actions as well. He no longer walked past her in the halls without a glance or a fleeting touch. Instead, he spoke to her with sincerity, his voice carrying the weight of what he had long kept hidden. His touch, though tentative at first, had become more frequent, more certain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the castle, Aldrin found himself once again in the royal gardens, waiting for Lyra. It was a quiet space, surrounded by blooming flowers and the scent of fresh earth, a place of calm, far from the busy halls of the palace. Lyra arrived quietly, as she always did, her steps soft on the stone path. She had changed into a simple gown, the kind she often wore when she wished to be at peace. No crown, no jewelry. Just the woman she had always been beneath the weight of her royal title. "Aldrin," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Lyra," he said, his voice steady, "I wanted to speak to you." "To apologize?" Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. She stopped before him, her heart beating faster than she expected. "You've already spoken your heart. There's nothing left to apologize for." But Aldrin shook his head. "I don't think you understand. All these years, I never truly saw you. I ruled by force, by fear, and I thought that was enough. I thought that I could protect you, but I was wrong." Lyra's eyes softened as she watched him. "Aldrin, you were never meant to protect me from everything. I've always been strong enough to fight my own battles." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "But you shouldn't have had to. You shouldn't have carried that burden alone. I should have seen that." The words hung between them for a moment, heavy with the unspoken truth. She had carried the weight of their marriage on her own for so long, never complaining, never asking for more. But now, Aldrin had finally seen the strength she had carried all these years. "Do you believe we can start over?" Aldrin asked, his voice low, almost uncertain. Lyra studied him for a moment, the silence stretching out between them. "I believe we can try," she said quietly. But it will take time, Aldrin. It will take trust. And trust is not something I can give easily. I understand, he said. I know I've lost your trust. But I'll earn it back. I'll prove to you that I'm not the man I was before. I'll be the husband you deserve. For a moment, they simply stood there, facing each other, as the last rays of sunlight bathed them in golden light. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. And then, in a moment that felt both natural and new, Aldrin reached out. He took her hand gently in his, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed him to hold her hand, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. I want to show you how much you mean to me, Lyra, Aldrin said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. I want to make up for everything I've missed. Lyra nodded, her heart fluttering in her chest. And I will be here, Aldrin. I will stand by your side, but only if you can promise me one thing. What is it? He asked, his brow furrowing slightly. That you will never take me for granted again, she said firmly. That you will always see me not just as a queen, but as your equal. As your partner? Aldrin looked into her eyes, his heart swelling with a mixture of regret and hope. I promise. I will never take you for granted again. The air between them seemed to shift, the tension between them dissolving into something softer, something more real. For the first time, they felt like true partners, two individuals with their own strengths, their own desires, coming together to form something stronger than what they had been alone. As the days passed, their bond grew. It wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual unfolding of trust and understanding. Aldrin began to spend more time with Lyra, not out of duty, but out of a genuine desire to know her. He would sit with her during meals, ask her about her thoughts on matters of the kingdom, and listen to her insights, valuing her wisdom as much as he valued his own. Lyra, in turn, found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't before. She shared her thoughts on the kingdom, on their people, and on her hopes for the future. She no longer felt as though she were an accessory to his reign. She was part of it. She was part of him. But there was still a long road ahead. The kingdom, after all, was not built on personal matters alone. Aldrin was still the king, and Lyra was still his queen. There were challenges to face, enemies to fight, and decisions to be made. But now, they faced those challenges together. One evening, as they stood before the great throne room, preparing to address the council, Aldrin turned to Lyra. He had always felt the weight of the throne upon his shoulders. But now, as he stood next to her, he felt lighter, stronger, together. They were an unstoppable force. You are the strength I've always needed. Lyra, Aldrin said, his voice filled with pride. And I will never forget that again. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth. And you are the king I always knew you could be, Aldrin. With that, they stepped forward, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held. Not as a king and a queen, but as equals, partners. And the beginning of something stronger than either of them could have imagined. The days had turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The kingdom of Arendar flourished under the rule of King Aldrin and Queen Lyra. But their greatest victory was not in the battles they fought or the lands they conquered. It was in the quiet strength of their bond. As the seasons changed, so did the kingdom. New alliances were formed, trade routes flourished, and the people began to thrive under the leadership of their united rulers. But within the walls of the royal palace, the changes were even more profound. Where once there had been silence and distance, there was now laughter and conversation. Where once Aldrin had been a king alone, he was now a king with his queen, his equal, his partner. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, when the weight of the crown felt too heavy for Aldrin, or when the responsibilities of being queen felt overwhelming for Lyra. But they faced these challenges together, always learning, always growing, and always supporting each other. One morning, as the sun rose over the kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Aldrin sat in his study, looking over reports from the council. The kingdom was at peace for now, but there were whispers of unrest in the neighboring lands. He had always been a warrior at heart, but now, more than ever, he understood the importance of strategy and diplomacy. He couldn't lead his people through force alone. He needed Lyra by his side, and she had proven time and time again that her wisdom was just as valuable as his strength. Lyra entered the study quietly, as she often did. Her presence, though silent, was always felt. She had grown into her role as queen, her voice now one that carried weight and respect among the people. She had found her place in the court, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in the kingdom's decisions. "Aldrin," she said softly, her voice a calm anchor in the busy chaos of the palace. "There is something I need to speak to you about." He looked up from the reports, his gaze meeting hers. There was a seriousness in her eyes that caught his attention. He set the papers aside and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" he asked. "I've heard troubling news from the borderlands," she began. "There are rumors of an uprising. It's not the first time we've heard such whispers, but this time, the situation may be more dire. The neighboring kingdom of Firel has been making moves to gain control of our trade routes." Aldrin frowned, his mind already racing with the possibilities. Firel had been a peaceful neighbor for many years, but the balance of power in the region had been shifting. He knew that this was not something to take lightly. "What do you suggest we do?" he asked, trusting her judgment completely. Lyra's eyes softened. "I think we need to send a diplomatic envoy. We can offer them a peaceful resolution, but we must also be prepared for the possibility that they may not want peace." Aldrin nodded. "I agree. We will send our best diplomats, but I'll also make sure our forces are ready if it comes to war." Lyra smiled faintly. "That's the king I know," she said, her eyes gleaming with pride. "But I am not the same king I once was," Aldrin said quietly. "I'm the man you've helped me become." Lyra's smile deepened. "And I'm the woman who has helped you see what truly matters." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the bond between them stronger than ever. There was no need for grand speeches or promises, just a deep understanding of the partnership they had built together. Over the next few days, preparations were made. The Royal Council was convened, and the diplomats were selected. Aldrin and Lyra worked side by side, drafting letters, making decisions, and ensuring that everything was in order. It was a time of tension, but also of hope. They had come so far, and they were determined to face whatever came next together. On the day the diplomatic envoy was set to depart, Aldrin and Lyra stood on the balcony of the royal palace, looking out over the kingdom. The people were gathered below, cheering for their rulers. It was a sight that filled Aldrin with pride, but also with a sense of responsibility. He had never taken the people's loyalty for granted. But now more than ever, he felt the weight of their trust. "You've come so far, Lyra," Aldrin said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "You've helped me become the man I should have been all along." "And you've become the king you always could be," she replied, her hand slipping into his. "Together we will lead this kingdom into a new era, one of peace, prosperity, and unity." Aldrin squeezed her hand gently. "And if Firel does not accept our offer of peace, then we will stand together, Aldrin," she said firmly. "We will fight for our people, for our kingdom, and for each other. But we will do so with honor." Aldrin looked down at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't think I've ever met anyone as strong as you, Lyra. You are my heart, my strength, and my greatest ally." "And you are mine, Aldrin," she replied, her voice full of conviction. "Together, we are unstoppable." The envoy departed that morning, carrying with it the hope of peace and the promise of a united front. Aldrin and Lyra watched as the diplomats rode off, their hearts filled with a mixture of anticipation and determination. No matter what the future held, they knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. Days passed, and the tension continued to build. The diplomats from Firel had been in negotiation for days, and Aldrin and Lyra waited anxiously for their return. They had prepared for every possible outcome, but the uncertainty still gnawed at them. They had done everything they could to avoid war, but they knew that sometimes diplomacy was not enough. Then one evening, a messenger arrived at the palace with word from the diplomats. Firol had agreed to the terms of the trade agreement, and the threat of war had been averted. Aldrin and Lyra stood together in the throne room, listening as the messenger delivered the good news. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Aldrin turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." Lyra shook her head, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We did it, Aldrin, together." In that moment, in the quiet of the throne room, surrounded by their people and their kingdom, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, more battles to fight, and more decisions to make. But they would face it all as equals, as partners. As a king and queen who had finally found their way to each other, the kingdom of Arendar was stronger than ever. Not because of the strength of its army or the wealth of its lands, but because of the strength of its rulers, two hearts bound together, facing the future as one.